So we're going to go through a brief intro. So who am I? What did I do to get here? How are we, working in the SOC together? I've been around in cybersecurity for about 20 years. I'm the field CTO here at WatchGuard for managed services. I was part of the acquisition of Act0. And for most of my career, I've been delivering SOC services, SOC products to customers, what has become known as managed detection and response. And so today's agenda is really going to be looking at the modernization of that SOC. It is the year 2025, and the next 2 years are going to be pretty interesting for cybersecurity. So we're going to go through some of the scenarios that we've been seeing play out over the past couple of years and how they've sort of transformed the SOC and its delivery. We're going to talk about artificial intelligence and how that's going to either, assist the adversary or us in the ways that that's going to manifest in the next couple of years, as well as, where MDR is going to fit into this model. And of course, we're here to answer your questions. I get a lot of questions about some of the data or, the different approaches that we see in the slideware. So, we're going to stop almost every slide here and ask questions about, what you're thinking. All right, so let's start very briefly with sort of a little bit of a background, but where managed detection and response fits into the security operations center model. It really pays to pay attention to artificial intelligence and its sort of evolution as in both an analytics tool as well as a automation tool for both the adversary and in the SOC. And if you look back to sort of the early years development of machine learning, the basics around 2005, it was one of the tools that was used to develop behaviors, right? These sort of smarter anti-malware, antivirus programs were using things like machine learning in order to develop better engines to find, viruses other than, just signatures, which were just sort of indicators that a specific file was in your environment. And we really got the wake-up call right around 2010, in the era where, there was advanced persistent threat actors, these very sophisticated pieces of malware designed and deployed by nation state actors. We really started to see a lot of changes in the way that cybersecurity attacks were starting to hit organizations. And that really meant that those behaviors, all that machine learning that we use to come up with these better ways of discovering and stopping threats, were going to have to be, deployed in much more product than they were at the time. And in 2014, there was another sort of milestone, and this is when DARPA issued their cybersecurity challenge, where they would have a lot of the sort of red team pen tester type engineers go and try to hack, in different systems. And in this challenge, they were specifically competing against AI to detect and patch vulnerabilities. And so kind of like that sort of AlphaGo back in the DeepMind days of, sort of challenging the computer to beat the human. This was a pretty big cornerstone for the adversary development and the concept of what artificial intelligence could both do for cybersecurity teams, but what it could also do in the wild. 2016, we saw the launch of a lot of the major machine learning on-device AI-based endpoint security products that started to sort of take over from the traditional either heuristic or signature-based anti-malware programs. This became a huge part, especially if you look at things like the firewall too, of analyzing, different types of packet, information to develop, next generation firewalls as well. So this era was, pretty promising for a lot of cybersecurity. I'd say this is one of those plateaus where we were starting to get as good as the adversary, maybe just a little bit better. And then in 2017, we started to see a bit of a shift, right? The rise of the ransomware gangs, these sort of very, very well-tuned advanced persistent threat actors that are building automation into all kinds of cyber attacks that meant they could start to take down networks in minutes. And so, that was obviously a big wake-up call for a lot of organizations. I think this is when, the attack groups that were starting to get famous by name, a lot of people in the news, your friends and family now know everybody that's being impacted by this sort of ransomware outbreak concept. And it really shortened the amount of time that you really had as a SOC engineer or an analyst to go and, find an attack and quarantine it, or to identify where the attacker was coming from and limit their access through credentials or IP addresses. And so this really started the race, right? This really put a timer on how long it took for a cybersecurity operations center to go and deploy countermeasures against an adversary. And so they'd measure a whole bunch of new statistics, mean time to respond, mean time to detect, the dwell time, all these sort of things started showing up in the lexicon for people to understand that the adversaries were starting to measure their attacks in terms of time and how many systems were impacted and then get paid for that. And you also saw, obviously, the reason there's a picture of him holding a Bitcoin lock is that the rise of crypto also really helped monetize a lot of the attacks, so that they were starting to get much more wealthy from these types of things. The next set of years are the ones we're probably most familiar with because they're the closest to recent memory, which is looking at the impact from these types of attacks. And when you started to see the adversaries targeting very large organizations that were deploying large scale security operation centers, different types of technology, defense in depth, adding multiple different tools and having all kinds of different approaches, and not necessarily being considered weak, but still being shut down by these attackers, you started to see that we weren't really as prepared in many cases for a lot of the ways that we were about to be surprised. And that really starts in 2020, what we kind of consider AI in GPT and other types of large language models and things like that were developed and sort of released right around that time. And so while this has been sort of touted as a big disruptor to things like the labor market, or it has deep impacts in the way we probably work with different systems like our phones and computers, we probably do a lot more queries in Chat GPT now than we had done in multiple different search engines. So if you look at this as a concept moving forward, people start to talk about the rise of deepfakes. But what we really want to call out in this webinar is sort of the next few years, right? The 2025 to 2027 era. This is one in which we think there's a lot more danger, right? The idea of agentic systems coming online that are both used by attackers, the rise in value of things like cryptocurrency is starting to make the dark economy worth a lot more than it was over the previous years, which really does both increase the number of attackers we're going to see, it'll increase the number of attacks we're going to see, and it will increase the monetization, it'll increase the value of those attacks for the adversary. And so when we get to those systems, we really do need a better answer than what we've been doing today. I'm going to pause here and just flip it over to Liz and see if we have any questions, just so that we're keeping it a little bit interactive with the teams here. Liz, do we have anything kind of coming in here, or any questions we might get to today on this one?
We do have a question. It is that the question's basically, there's concern that AI is replacing jobs. So the question around is, are you suggesting that there's no longer a role for humans in cybersecurity?
Yeah, I think when you look at the red bar and you say, fully autonomous attack, fully autonomous, requirements from each one of these things, we talk about the evolution of automation and what it means to defend against it. The role of the human does change, right? From having to flip between multiple consoles and having to interact with, the sort of same dashboards and buttons that they were in the past. It transforms considerably when you have multiple agents doing things. You can kind of think of it more like you left the orchestra playing the violin and now you're the conductor, right? You have the idea that you're going to be able to orchestrate multiple different systems that were probably doing what one role would have done in the past. But given the volume that we're anticipating, given the idea that these systems will still require a human on the loop, you are going to see a transformation in the way that the SOC is delivered and the automation that's required to try to get the speed and the context that you need. But at least for the next 4 or 5 years, you are going to still see the need for cybersecurity analysts to be the conductors and to work with these systems. It's just going to get a little bit easier for them to get information. It's going to get a lot faster. There's going to have to be a lot more sort of concepts of playbooks. You're sort of coaching the team and then letting them run on the field, as opposed to just doing everything play by play and running the books yourselves. Great question, and keep them coming. All right, many of these prognostications, whatever you call them, guesses at how the future is going to go, are always, sometimes a little bit doom and gloom. And there's very little, I think, evidence in many cases that people can point to say, Well, if you believe that it's going to be an agentic adversary and there's going to be, so many more AI-based attacks, why haven't, if it's going to happen in 2 years, we've seen, with the evolution of AI moving so quickly, many more versions of these deep fakes or many more versions of these compromises that are purely based on sort of pure AI, capabilities. And it's important to take stock of where we are right now. By 2025, the dark economy has sort of amassed $10.5 trillion in, revenue for the adversary. And if you look at, some of the ways that the costs have been translated back to businesses, the idea is that about 25% of that 10 trillion has been business disruption, right? So it's not necessarily, making them richer, but it is making us poorer, right? The idea that we're going to have to either inflate prices or have to potentially, change our go-to-market or something, our pricing, to reflect the fact that we've now had this sort of outage that cost us a bunch of money or lost revenue, if we can afford to continue on. But many of the other fraud that contributes to that 10.5 trillion is something that benefits the adversary. And when you look at the financial compensation of a hacker group and you pick, let's say Lazarus Group in North Korea, right? You have accounts that are seized when we do these sting operations in the $1.2 billion, right? In terms of crypto. And so it's very important to understand that this is no longer just a sort of few $1,000s or, a small remuneration that you're giving to an attack group that's out in the wild somewhere that is just going to take the money and move on. It is funding a pretty large apparatus of hackers that are monetizing more and more and more by this. And like I said in the previous slide, the advent of crypto sort of engaged a lot of people on the ransomware side. Now they're attacking the crypto directly. So the idea that you could just steal money out of the wallet in the Bybit breach, for example, billions of dollars removed from people's crypto wallets worldwide. And the idea is that, on the other side, the infrastructure side, the side that IT is meant to protect, you do have this concept that we're still not moving as fast as we could be. I think a lot of people would say it would be good if this would slow down. It'd be good if they found a better way to do this. If we could deploy better automation, we'd be maybe okay. But when you look at how teams are doing, right, and the fact that major operating systems like Windows, Linux, and Mac still release north of 100 of critical vulnerabilities a year, and on average it takes a team about 55 days to patch them. With the source code that they even find those vulnerabilities in, having one per 5,000 lines of code, and systems like Windows or TikTok or something having in the tens of thousands or tens of millions of lines of source code, it makes it pretty easy if the adversary had a tool to automate the building of a 0-day to then push down a cyber attack more cheaply. If you think about what a really expensive, really valuable 0-day for Windows might be, you might be able to get one on the market for $1 million, right? And that would be something that you might purchase as a nation state or something to try to run a very significant operation where you needed to infiltrate, Windows and burn that expensive 0-day. But if you lower the cost of that 0-day and you look at how many can exist within the source code, then it just stands to reason that we're going to have a much more continuous attack cycle here. And that things like when an attacker comes into an environment and reaches their objective and leaves, whether that's the dwell time or the breakout time, however you're measuring them getting in and what it takes to move around and cause destruction and get out, those numbers are obviously going to fall even further, right? And so you're going to see an even tighter timeline pushing the need for this more agentic system to be brought online. Also, in the same vein, we have a number of regulators that are increasing the number of fines that we see. So whether it's the full, control set from the HIPAA security rule becoming mandatory, or AI EU Act type of regulation, there is a lot of changes on the governance side that's also going to make it expensive to try to build and deploy and manage these systems with the data required to do it, right? So you have a couple of competing forces here. But most of those things sort of lead to the reason why we think the 2025 to 27 era is going to be one of agentic SOC systems. I'll pause here and see if there's more questions coming up. I know we hear the little chime and
We
Liz.
do have one more question. What if my budget isn't big enough to purchase a platform? What happens to this AI approach?
So if you don't have the ability to purchase a platform, we got to dig in. We're going to dig in a minute into like what a platform actually is and how it needs to work and why that's the basis of some of this stuff. But the idea is that budget is always going to be a concern. What we see on here is the dollars spent in the top right. We spend $200 billion a year around that for cybersecurity tools to arm the SOC. And we still don't have kind of a perfect constellation where everybody has access. It's not fully democratized. So that, the idea is that the smaller organizations, some of whom might say, well, I'm not going to be a target, or I'm not that interesting, or my customer base isn't that interesting, because they're smaller companies. And the more that the adversary automates, the less focus they have on who they're hitting, right? Because it doesn't cost them any more to go downstream to a small company than it does to go upstream. And so if they're disrupting the cost on the adversary and it's going down, then you're going to face the same challenges as a large organization. And so if you don't have the budget for a cybersecurity platform, that's something that the platform companies have to solve for you. That's something that a company like WatchGuard has to solve for you in terms of how to deliver the service where you're not incurring the cost of the labor or expensive technology components that are critical, but you can't buy them because you just don't have the wallet to afford it. And so that is something that also has to be condensed here. So we're not going to add more money to the problem and solve it. It's a great way to kind of answer the question, is to say you can't just say spend more. You can't say hire more, because there's just not as many IT professionals and cybersecurity professionals that it would take to scale this problem. And if you want an example of that, if your SLA on a critical threat is only 30 minutes and one analyst takes 30 minutes to sort of handle it and quarantine it, and I would say that would be one of the better analysts out there, they can only handle 8 in a day, right, or 15 in a day, because you can't split an 8-hour workday much more than that. And so if you said, okay, now we're going to throw twice the number of attacks at them, what's going to happen if it requires a human response, right? We can't hire 2 more people. We can't scale up when we're under attack to 10 people at a time, right? So, we're not going to be able to crowdsource this thing. How are we going to actually deliver that? And so that's a big part of the budget, a big part of the cost. It's also a big part of not being able to scale up the solution. All of that kind of pointing to the agentic system must both lower the cost for the consumer, the customer, and also have an impact that is going to make it a little bit easier to manage, right? So why don't we jump into what the MDR's role is in the autonomous SOC? That's enough doom and gloom. Let's get to some good stories about how this is going to change. The first is that when you look at an autonomous SOC, one of the things that you can't do is just focus on one part of the IT environment, right? If you look at what we've done since the pandemic, if you look at the fact that we've been sort of hybrid remote for many organizations, it was sort of an incomplete migration to a full cloud design for many, many companies. Most of them still have an office or have some sort of data center, some sort of on-prem workloads. They have workstations, they have SaaS products, they have mobile phones, they connect on third-party networks, home networks, all kinds of other ways that they're going to interact with their data and applications. And so if we're going to have an approach that's going to secure the environment, it must do so in all of these places. And that increases the difficulty, of course, but it has to be done realistically. You can't simply set up an autonomous SOC and one version of a cloud and say, okay, well, your cloud workloads are protected, but your workstations are fully vulnerable, or anything outside of your hosting in AWS is not going to get any kind of cybersecurity monitoring, right? While it's a shared responsibility and we've kind of moved a lot of workloads up there, you still have workloads everywhere, right? You still have critical pieces that you allow access to these environments and other networks that make them less secure. So you must secure them all at the same time. The second problem to solve is the harder problem to solve, right? You can't just simply move through the ecosystem. And just give me 1 second here to see if I can just get rid of that little pop-up. One of the things that you have to do, of course, is build the agentic system itself. And for many years, people haven't known that word, right? If you type in agentic into your text box, you're probably going to see little red spelling mistakes at the bottom, because this is not an English word, is what you'll hear from Microsoft Word. But the word agentic is going to show up in the lexicon a lot more in our strategies around building the SOC and cybersecurity. And this is because a lot of the systems that we sort of say need AI and what we need out of them to have AI and what we need to disrupt to make these systems smarter and better is traditional tools in the SOC, traditional systems that we put in, from the endpoint to the analytics platform, vulnerability managers, other orchestration tools. They need to start developing things that are agentic. Now, they just didn't necessarily have the word agentic in 2022 when this sort of study was produced. But the idea is that everybody could identify the systems that we're going to get and the processes that we're going to get better impacts or better value, better business value by having AI embedded in them, whether it's through machine learning or large language models or some sort of agentic outcome in terms of how they ran, right? They ran sort of completely autonomous in the background. And Liz, I think we got a poll that we want to be able to release on this slide. So
yep, launching now.
So the poll is, are you using AI in your security tools today? And this is a great question because I think that some people will say, I don't even know if my vendor is using AI, or I haven't seen it necessarily. This could be something like large language models that you communicate with to get information from your SOC. This could be something like a machine learning detection or some sort of note that you get in one of your alerts that says this was detected by machine learning or some sort of AI-based engine. So I'll let the poll run. I want to say a little bit longer here before we sort of share the results. It's kind of skewing towards the yes. I'd also be curious to hear comments about what that yes is based on. If it's just in the AV, is it in your email? Is it in the the chat GPT telling you what a vulnerability scan result actually is and how to fix it?
Just close it.
Dead heat. Oh, okay, 50-50. So half do and half don't. And this is one of the things that I think is going to be important when you look at why we need to solve this problem agentically and where we need to solve this problem, in what area of the environment is this going to be consumed. And this will start to deliver on the word platform. You're going to hear me say the word platform a couple of times in this presentation. But the idea is that you do have a kill chain. This is the adversary working against you to try to get your data and monetize, or to steal your sensitive information, maybe actually break into your crypto wallet, maybe commit wire fraud or something like that, to try to compensate themselves for these actions, right? They're not doing this for fun, they're doing this for money. And the idea is that if you look at the attack life cycle, right, from left to right, getting closer to that bag of money, you have a couple of different areas that you can use, right, sort of stepping stones to get there, right? You can compromise identity. People will talk about dark web scans, credential loss, all kinds of other ways in which attackers are, grabbing and selling your credentials. They have obviously networks they have to traverse in order to get there. So the network that you probably don't even think of that's on the way to your cloud or SaaS apps, the network that is leaving your workstations or coming to your servers. And so this idea of network traffic being one of the things that they have to do to get the payload over to you, it's just part of the science of how they get data across, has to be protected. And then of course natively, once you get inside those systems, right, the cloud or the endpoint, you have to kind of get in and go between maybe the systems or the applications or the file folders or whatever it is that gets you much, much closer. So that's sort of your last mile, the last place you can sort of defend against this is actually within the cloud and the endpoint. And the other two sort of move the attacker further up to have to break into those things first to get access to those other critical pieces. So when you think about how we've structured the third problem of saying, look, you have to develop sort of a platform approach. You have to develop the right control points that will allow you to find and stop the adversary as early as possible. So you're not simply letting them take over and say, okay, my AI is really in my endpoint, and then I have a large language model in my SIM, and therefore I really know the best of there is in terms of the AI when something happens, right? You don't want to wait until something happens. You want to try to move them as far away from you as possible and make it as difficult as possible to get in there. And so when you look at the last mile, right, WatchGuard Core MDR, the release that we had earlier this year, it was around protecting your endpoint and your cloud, right? Microsoft 365 and your workstation servers, Windows, Linux, Mac machines that were running your critical apps that connect to those clouds, right? So core basically is sort of the foundation of trying to stop attackers from breaking into the environment, moving through the environment, and deploying things like ransomware, stealing your data. But next week we are launching WatchGuard Total MDR. And this is going to unlock a lot of the things that WatchGuard has invested years and years and years in developing, things like the firewall and firebox, things like AuthPoint for identity, and use those within the system to bring all those detections, bring that telemetry back to the managed detection response team, and operate across endpoint, network, and cloud with sort of one holistic approach to finding and stopping the adversary. It not only gives us more opportunities to be able to find and block the adversary, it gives us more telemetry to find them earlier. So the idea of delivering through a platform is pretty important. The idea of a comprehensive managed detection and response service, the idea of a agentic SOC, the idea of a modern way to incorporate new tools like artificial intelligence above the telemetry we have, is simply something that has to be done on a pretty consistent, prepared data set that has a lot of control in a lot of different ways. So one of the things that's going to be important through this is that you're building things based on unified threat visibility, right? The idea that you have visibility into what's happening at the network, visibility of what's happening between the identity and the access that's coming to your box accounts and your other third-party SaaS accounts that are outside, that your network is much more than just a simple, collection of data center networks, right? It's everything going from your workstations and phones to the clouds and the SaaS apps, and everything that's also flowing into your office, and everything that's flowing outside over to your third-party SaaS products, right? So having complete visibility of the network, this allows you that foundation to use that word nobody loves, the zero trust words that help you identify the attack in all these different places. Let's actually go and ask a question actually really quickly. I see them kind of piling up. I want to make sure we can get to all of those instead of saving them all for the end. Liz, is there? I see some stuff in the chat.
Yep. So you mentioned that WatchGuard is going to be launching a total MDR. So at this point in time, can you give some specific examples of how it's used at WatchGuard? Like what's currently
Yes.
visible?
So keep in mind the service is launching fully next week, but the examples of why, and especially through the testing and at Act Zero, we had a lot of similar types of use cases, which I think is what makes us such an attractive fit together. But one of the things that you can see is some of the attacks that you'd have, for example, where attackers would bypass multi-factor authentication by copying a cookie and then jumping over to log into your 365 accounts, right? If you're a partner or a customer, you for sure have heard a story like this. And then once they get into the cloud, they go and change the mail forwarding rules and they try to grab some sensitive information from an invoice or something, or a wire transfer that's been conducted in the past, and then contact the vendor, supplier, customer of that company, and then do the wire fraud, right? So it's a very, very common playbook. You see all kinds of ways in which the social engineering it takes to trick the user into clicking these links is getting so good. The phishing emails are increasing the click-through rate. The spam filters are having a much harder time, stopping those kinds of things. And so, those attacks are a great example because that's here and now, right? And so when you think about the ecosystem, if they were to grab that cookie and log into the cloud, for example, and try to take your mailboxes and change them over to impersonate your users, that's something that you can detect with the connection that we have to that cloud system, right, within the platform. If you want to further harden it from that happening again and detect the actual theft of the cookie, well, the EDR is going to detect that the browser is going to try to steal your cookie. And then the network that you're saying has to be the tunnel that gets access to all these places. The only location you can access something through is my secured tunnel. And the only secure tunnel the only time you can get into that tunnel is when you're running the EDR, really starts to cut down the capability to steal the cookie, to use the cookie, to take that access and cause mayhem when you get access to the cloud. So each one of these components plays a critical role in something like Total in stopping an attack that frankly is currently beating the common designs that we see in these hybrid environments, where they just simply throw on multi-factor authentication, they have an EDR on the endpoint, they kind of leave everything in the middle to chance. And so having the Total system in place to kind of detect and block that at the various points that the attacker is going to either attempt or succeed and pivot, we need to show that really does showcase what it is. Now, finding that type of attack is also another difficult thing, right? Because it's nice to say all that, and that's great if it's set up that way. But just having the tools and having them enabled to detect that kind of thing really helps when you start to look at AI-driven correlation, right? So the idea that even with our existing models today, when you have something like Total, we're connected to your cloud, and we have your the EDR endpoint in there, we can extrapolate which connections that are happening in your cloud are actually from systems that do not have EDR deployed, right? So that kind of correlation is very difficult unless you can do a couple things. You can infer, you can comb through a lot of data really quickly, you can do analysis on millions of logins and different sort of disparate log sources. So it's a great way to showcase the value of something like a machine learning based detection that has thousands of variables, which is what you need when you're talking about the difference of a login of somebody that may be almost exactly the same as you, the same browser, the same workstation, as at least as it's reported back to the system. So that's a critical little technical piece that you need to pull that off. And then the other thing is you have to eliminate the idea that this is going to take over and break a critical thing like logging into 365. So the human-led SOC investigation is there to offer the intuition of the analyst, to take the context that these systems are doing, and then deploy countermeasures, which may be in the form of policy or direct actions across these four different systems. And so that's really a key piece of how, even in that one example of how Total can solve the problem today and in the future, that it's solving the problem with things like pass the cookie attacks today. So just to put it all together, what does it actually look like? There is a lot of different components here, but they have to all work together. And so the idea behind that release, the idea behind anything that's going to sort of promote itself as a platform, is that it probably has to aggregate all the telemetry. It can't just simply hook in and take alerts, but not take the data, because if you're not learning things about the behavior of the systems from the data, if you're not taking the new things that are coming from the threat hunters and able to search easily through that single set of data, you're not really going to have the capability that it's going to take to build a good threat hunting team, to build a good threat hunting process, to offer a consistent approach across the customers. And a great example of this is a new vulnerability or a new threat, shows up. How quickly can you go through the entirety of your customer base and see if you're protected, right? Or deploy a countermeasure. And so just having that platform, which may involve multiple different changes that you have to make just for one single attack, is going to be important, and that's going to have to be orchestrated. So as an example, you take the telemetry in, you can now threat hunt on it in the WatchGuard infra. If you have alerts that then are produced and they go through these engines, they're going to have a lot better false positive rate, which you can see if you trial the service, or if you know somebody that's got the service, you can ask them what their false positive rate is. And you can see that when it comes down and you got real information that is of high priority, you can then do things to disrupt the adversary by coordinating a response directly, right? And then instead of having your team consume what is supposed to be an autonomous driverless car by doing a whole bunch of functions at the other end, you basically have the outcome, right? You have the response, the containment. You can sort of get full details in a portal and ask more questions of your analyst, but the idea is you don't have to necessarily get involved in that critical last mile sort of step. Questions on this part?
No questions from the audience, but I have another poll question for
Awesome.
the audience to answer.
Okay, do you believe your SOC is fully automated? I think a lot of people, we do have some yeses coming in. Full SOC automation would mean, even if it does involve sort of a person to review what happened, that you believe you could maybe even contain an adversary and not have to necessarily jump in immediately to do something manual, right? So a lot of people will set a different bar for what automation really means, but the idea is if you could get to the point where the adversary is contained and you don't feel an immense pressure to jump in and do something, uh, then you do have a little bit more automation.
I'm gonna end the poll here, so get your answers in. And then we do have a question, so maybe I'll leave the poll up, Adam, while I ask you this question from the audience.
Sure.
Um, do or does cookie stealing and logging in bypass MFAs?
It does, yes. When you have a multi-factor authentication solution, you have to remember what layer it operates at. So the idea is that when you log in, for example, to Microsoft 365, and you've enabled maybe a token on your phone, or you've gotten a push notification from a supplier, right? That usually is going to verify the user. And then wherever you were logging in from, be it your laptop or another device, right? That creates the cookie, right? So now you have a little session that you use to communicate with Microsoft. That's just the way the protocol works. So attackers figured this out and then said, well, if we just take the cookie that's generated post authentication, it'll allow me to log right in to that application, right? To Office 365. And then I have the same access the user does, and I can do a whole bunch of bad stuff. So the idea that MFA alone would solve the cookie stealing problem is not there. It verifies the user, authenticates them, and then whatever application then allows it a cookie to access it, right? So it is a very, very key part in making sure you're not doing things like credential stuffing, where I know your password and I just log in with no verification. And it makes it a little bit more difficult for you to generate cookies on things you don't trust, right? So, for example, if your MFA product was an enterprise one like AuthPoint, you could check that the devices, for example, that are doing the authentication are ones that you trust that have an EDR on them to prevent cookie theft if it was attempted, right? So you can use an enterprise MFA product to require that people look for other tools that would stop a cookie theft. By itself, it won't stop the cookie theft. You need the other product like the EDR to actually find and stop it. Or you need something like a SASE product like FireCloud to make sure that you're coming through a secure tunnel and then restrict all access in the tenant to only those tunnel IPs, which is a very strong way to say, you're only coming from trusted devices and you're only coming from trusted users, right?
Adam,
I
there
hope that
is a
answers it.
follow-up question to that. Do you
Shoot.
want to quickly address the poll question so then I can close that out and then we can do the follow-up?
Yes. So 67% of you said no if we close the poll today. That is a good ratio, at least because the community doesn't have a fully autonomous SOC yet. It's difficult to say that people have built one and that they are operating one. I think that they believe they're autonomous for the attacks that they've received so far, but that if we were to ratchet up the pressure, the fully autonomous system would start to show its cracks. That is either human-driven requirements to augment systems that are incapable of dynamically responding to an adversary. Pass the cookie is a great example, or that they simply have some of their processes automated that they've defined in the SOC, and they're unaware that there's new processes or dynamic processes that need to be added to it to become autonomous. So yeah, great response on the poll. Thank you guys for answering those questions. Liz, do you want to go to the follow-up now?
Yep. So to the previous question, how does a bad actor get access to their cookie from their phone?
Right. So a lot of each application on a phone, for example, will have its own user space, right? It's got its own little file system. They share a few different things. So if you get like a link from WhatsApp on your phone or something and you click on it, it'll usually open in whatever, it'll pass that part of the conversation over to the browser, right? And then once you get over to the browser, right, you're now at, let's say, a hacker's website, right? And so if you then, decide that you're going to have a little relay between the actual Microsoft login page and the user, the idea is that you could get them almost to like frame it, capture it through JavaScript, a bunch of different ways that you could grab the credential after they sort of logged in successfully and generated the cookie through something like the browser or their page. So there's a lot of different ways that they would go and try to grab the cookie off of a mobile device. Certainly the browsers on the workstation have a whole bunch of different ways that you can grab it. So there's lots of different ways to steal those cookies from logins that are like Office 365 and things like that, pretty common logins that people would have. And again, there's some user education here. I don't want to make it sound like it's an all technology thing. Like if the user never knew that that website was fake or that they're not supposed to log into Microsoft, they're supposed to log into AuthPoint, you're never supposed to log in directly. You could try to train them on that. But in our experience, when we see after user training what the click-through rate is on the bad stuff, it's about 15%, or at least it used to be. When they use very, very sophisticated tools like large language models to build very convincing versions of these pages and emails, et cetera, the user has a very little chance of actually determining that it's a fake, right? The deep fake concept is that it's harder to spot the fake. And so it's not just about impersonating, people and things. You can impersonate websites and whole companies on LinkedIn. That's really why those attacks will continue to be more successful. The mobile operating system is more secure, frankly, than the Microsoft Windows or Linux in the way that it's designed, so that it doesn't have all this kind of sharing for cookie stealing to happen easier. But it doesn't mean it doesn't happen on the phone. It definitely does. Okay, we can demo a few of these things. I've got a couple of sort of AI-based attacks, maybe some logic in the back end here that we can have. I wanted to take, maybe a minute to just sort of go through some of these fakes. Let me just go here. Whoa. Yeah. And sort of give you kind of some of these examples that you may have heard of. So we're going to have a link in the presentation to some of these, little attacks. It's kind of fun to run them yourself, but again, we'll load this up and send it off with the recording after the call. We have, for example, the ability to run a deepfake. If you haven't done one of these, it basically take an image off a website, right, and use that image or likeness to impersonate the user live on something like this, webcast or Zoom or some other, Teams environment. And so this is an easy way for attackers to leverage existing AI to create deepfakes for video. There's also voice mod technology that there are many open source tools. There's great products like 11 Labs where you can upload your own voice and just change around the voice in real time, right?
Everyone, I'm using voice mode, and that's something that they
had a lot less books in that video. And then the concept that the adversary has access to very complex models, and that they're going to be deriving things like ransomware or malware or something that the AI engines themselves, the large language models we trust and love like OpenAI or Copilot or something, that they're going to continue to protect us from getting the bad parts of the AI out, is a great example of something called jailbreaking, right? And the idea is that if you could fill in a prompt, right, you could prompt hack the engine, you can get it to derive pretty much anything you want. So for example, if I asked this to make methamphetamine recipes or something, right, it would kind of take a couple prompts perhaps on 3.5, but then eventually it would just sort of key out what you needed, right? So the idea that there are layers to these things and that those layers are quite complex in understanding what the tokens are asking and trying to derive a very good response makes it difficult to apply cybersecurity in the front end for attackers not to be able to leverage that, or even a layperson to use very powerful models. So the security tools in the models aren't as strong as the security vulnerability they can derive from the models if you can get rid of that very basic layer. So those are kind of two demos of an image, voice, and then obviously things like automation, building malicious prompts and source code. You could also just grab your favorite, malware products, right? Whatever it is, some Conti ransomware, grab the actual locker file, put it into a known language model, and just have the code optimized, right? And then the idea that you would then build an agentic system to find the relationships at a company you want to target and send them very sophisticated phishing emails, and then deploy the ransomware to their product with a callback to your, Bitcoin. That's really just where the adversaries are, right? When we talk about people like Lazarus Group, this is the kind of automation that they already have. And so, on the good side, right, on our side, there is the concept of being able to use models for good, right? So in the different products, of course, being able to provide very simple risk scores that may be a very big combination of different factors that are difficult for you to create just a very simple rule on, right? You just sort of have this much deeper understanding now of the risk that's involved with a particular asset, with a particular user, with a particular process or application. So those kinds of things are distributed between the WatchGuard products. But then, of course, we also have different ways that we're leveraging machine learning and AI within the service. So for the customer, when they look at something like their console, right, the first thing is they want to be able to reduce noise. So us being able to compress a whole bunch of maybe disparate alerts that did not need to be escalated, those kinds of things can be brought forth in tickets that then collapse a lot of that information. And that really can help us speed something like, mean time to first response. So that what the customer really sees is kind of like an analyst's way of explaining what happened, but that, behind the scenes, the idea that you'd have, these sort of systems that would be based on, correlation of these complex things, such as where are the attacks actually leveraged between, the different assets. How are things like long cycle attacks that typically avoid detection, finding the root cause of that and containing the threat there, so that as these tools that we develop in the back end, get sharper and sharper, and we use things like language models or machine learning models to find and stop attacks on your behalf, you don't necessarily have to dial into training the model and figuring out the policy and changing all the tooling in the back end. A lot of that stuff will be run by the SOC and then delivered in very simple terms, like escalations that involved containment. But it gives us opportunities to add, different things to the stack and still expand our capability to find and to stop things across. And so, behind the scenes in total, as you add, network, identity, endpoint-based threats all together, you'll see that consumption start to go down rather than look at every single alert and try to figure out what's going on yourself. The SOC will do that. Questions on anything I just showed? It's just sort of a brief walkthrough. There could be tons of different things that we could demo for you. Of course, we will be happy to set up follow-up calls with you to dig deep on anything we talked about today. But are there more questions from the audience, Liz, that we want to get to?
No questions, but definitely everyone, we're coming close to the end here, so please send them if you have any. But of course, as Adam said, we're happy to do more in-depth demos with anyone that would like one.
Awesome. Well, we'll give it a minute for questions. If there aren't any, we thank you very much for joining the webinar. We hope to see you on the next one. And again, like I said, just reach out to us and we'd be happy to do deeper dives on anything you saw today.